Hello, everyone. Welcome to you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world today. We have many people who are joining us for this presentation. This is Welcome to the Human Rights and Psychology webinar series. Today's webinar is on how human rights matter to the profession of psychology. This is the inaugural webinar in a series that will be broadcasting every 2 months or so over the next 2 years that will give a comprehensive look at the intersection of human rights and psychology. I'm Andy Simon. I am a board member and president-elect of the International Council of Psychologists, and I'm co-hosting today's webinar with Dr. Mary Bullock, who's also a leader at the International Council of Psychologists and a creator of the Global Network of Psychologists for Human Rights. Our speakers today are Dr. Nora Sveas and Dr. Mike Wessels, and our moderator is Dr. Marlena Plavšić, member of the steering committee of the Global Network of Psychologists for Human Rights and faculty at the Juraj Dubrela University of Pula in Croatia. The Global Network of Psychologists for Human Rights was launched in 2020 with the goal of being a platform for us all to collate bibliographic resource materials on human rights and psychology, to identify and publicize human rights issues, and promote human rights education and a human rights lens in the work that we do. You may subscribe to the network on its website. You'll see the link on the screen right now, and you will receive a monthly bulletin on current human rights issues, resources, and events. We very much encourage you to join. The International Council of Psychologists, the co-host of this event, is a global organization focused on human rights, dignity, and justice. It holds an annual meeting and hosts interest groups on a variety of topics. Membership is open to all whose work is in psychology or of a psychological nature. Now, I'd like to turn our program right now over to today's moderator, Dr. Marlena Plavšić. Marlena, please join us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Andy. I'm really thrilled to see people greeting from all the continents as far as I could see. And I'm really very happy to see that the interest is high. I hope not just for the topic today, but also for the whole webinar series in which we combine a link, psychology and human rights. And now let us remind ourselves or learn about today's speakers. I'm sure many of you do know who Nora and Mike are, but I'm also sure that some of you don't. So let me start with Nora. Nora is a professor emerita at the University of Oslo in Norway. She worked as clinical psychologist and researcher mostly with refugees and victims of torture in many countries of the world. Her special interest is on the relationship between human rights and psychology. Nora has taught and written about forced migration, human rights, gender-based violence in conflict, and transitional justice, to name the hot topics, so to say, that Nora is involved with. But the particular focus Nora has is the right to redress and rehabilitation. Nora is initiator of the Mental Health and Human Rights Info, an NGO providing information on health and human rights for professionals that work in conflict areas. And she is also the initiator of the Human Rights Committee of the Norwegian Psychological Association. Nora was a member of the UN Committee Against Torture, and currently she is a member of the UN Subcommittee on Prevention of Torture. For her work on human rights, Nora was awarded the Amnesty International Award, the University of Oslo's Human Rights Prize, and the most recent one, the Royal Norwegian Order of St. Olaf. Mike Wessels is professor at Columbia University, United States of America, in the program on forced migration and health. As a longtime psychosocial and child protection practitioner, Mike has conducted extensive research on the holistic impacts of war and political violence against children. Mike has worked extensively on issues of recruited children, and he authored a book called Child Soldiers: From Violence to Prevention. Currently, Mike is lead researcher or interagency multi-country research on community-led child protection, which includes strengthening of national child protection systems. This work has included, as Mike says it, learning from girls and boys directly about their lived experience of both violence and their coping and resilience amidst adversity. Mike regularly advises UN agencies, governments, and donors on issues of child protection and psychosocial support, including communities and schools. Both Nora and Mike have contributed to the book Human Rights Education for Psychologists by writing a joint chapter. The book was published in 2020 by Routledge. Now, the presentation that both Mike and Nora will last about 40-45 minutes. And after that, we will have some 15 minutes for a discussion. You will post your questions in the chat box or question and answers box. So let's proceed now with the presentation. Nora will be the first one to talk. Nora, the screen and the mic are yours.
Thank you very much, Marlena. And it's great to see all the greetings coming in from different parts of the world. And I'm both very pleased and very honored to be part of this webinar and be able to speak with you today. So when Mike and I have finished our introductions, we do hope that we can have a conversation about some of these issues that we are raising. As you already said, we are speaking about human rights in our profession, and I will give you 3 examples from our practical work and also refer to rights and obligations that come into play with respect to these 3 cases. So to start with, I want to say the following. When looking at the basic ambitions, developments, ethical platforms, we see that the obligations entailed in the international human rights conventions and declarations not only converge with what psychologists do, but offer also a meaningful ethical guidance for our profession. Mike and I wrote this in the chapter that in the book that Marlena just referred to. So I'd like to ask the following questions. How is it that we can say such a thing? Why is it that this is so relevant for us as psychologists? And last but not least, what is the role of psychologists and how can we do this in defending, protecting, and promoting human rights? I will, as I said, illustrate this with 3 fictional examples. And through this, I will refer to basic rights, to mechanisms and to conventions, but I will not go into these in any detail. What these examples have in common is that they raise not only serious professional and ethical issues, but when putting on our human rights lenses, we will also see that all of these raise serious human rights issues as well. So these may call on us both to reflect, to react, and act also beyond the therapeutic room and beyond what we often consider our professional role and responsibility. So it is at this point that we hope that we can enlarge the scope of what we consider as psychological practice in general. So to start with the first one, Nassim, victim of torture. He has a story of imprisonment and torture. He was let out of prison after 5 years and managed to leave the country. He belonged to a group that was considered enemies of the state, and he was afraid that both he himself and his family were in danger, also after having been let out of detention. He is now applying for an asylum in a European country. He has stayed at an asylum center for more than a year when you, as a psychologist, first meet him. He had then been referred by the doctor at the asylum center. When you meet a refugee client, the first he tells you is that he is fearing forced return to his country. He has been tortured in his country of origin, and he's also sure that he risks torture if he returns. The severe psychological and physical problems he is struggling with after the violations in prisons have not been addressed earlier. You quickly understand that he has not been offered any assessment or documentation on the torture that he has been subjected to, or nor any assessment of the injuries that follows the torture. You also learn that the asylum interviews have dealt more with the travel route than the fact that he was actually tortured before he left, and that he also alleges torture at return. He tried to move into this theme when he was in the interview, but he really didn't manage. It was, as he said afterwards, as if there was no room for him to speak about the torture in the asylum interview. So, but in addition to, he has great problems speaking about the torture, and he's afraid that not being consistent and clear when explaining may even diminish his chances for protection. You understand that there's a lot to do from a therapeutic point of view, but also there are major human rights issues involved in this case. First of all, you understand that the UN Manual for the Documentation of Torture and Ill Treatment, that we usually know as the Istanbul Protocol, has not been applied, neither to describe what he has been exposed to or to assess the gravity of his injuries. And failing to do so in cases of tortured asylum seeker actually goes against advices from international monitoring mechanisms on this point. Furthermore, you see that the state you're actually working for or in may actually soon be violating one of the most internationally acclaimed principles, namely non-refoulement. That means the prohibition against returning a person to torture or risk of torture. You know, of course, that former torture does not in itself guarantee protection from torture or from return, but former torture may often predict future torture, and therefore essential to have this assessed and documented. Also, Nassim tells you that he may also want to seek justice in his country in the future, and at this point also having this documented is very, very important. So you are afraid at this point that the story that he has not been told fully, and that you should also want him to be given the possibility of saying or telling his story again. And at this point, you also think that you want to use your scientifically based knowledge on how severe trauma may affect concentration, memory, and recall, and the ability to talk about trauma, in addition to what often torture victims are troubled with, namely the lack of confidence to other people. So you think, as a psychologist you are, that this may be important for the agency or for the ministry working on asylum determination procedure to be aware of, so that they can call him in again and he can provide them with the important information that they need for them to establish whether he is worthy of protection or not. But you're also quite concerned that he has not been provided with any form of rehabilitation before he met you just very recently. And this is something also which falls under the obligation of the states under the UN Committee Against Torture. And the general comment to the UN Convention Against Torture says also very clearly that it is an obligation to provide persons with rehabilitation when they are victims of torture, regardless of their formal status in the country, and that redress may include also rehabilitation. So again, there's a lot of things to work with, and your challenge now is to ensure that Nassim, in fact, can enjoy these internationally agreed upon rights. So as you see, the Convention Against Torture in this context is extremely important. So moving to the next example, woman exposed to violence and frequent attempts at reporting. This is about Sarah, a woman you meet in a shelter for battered women. She tells you about the violence that she has been exposed to at home over a long period of time, and you understand that this is a story of many failures and lack of due diligence in relation to dealing with her situation. The police has, despite her several attempts to report, failed to follow up on this case. No investigation was ever initiated. She was not offered any protection, and she did not know where to turn for help. Also because she felt under constant threat. Despite the fact that she has been seeing doctors on various occasions when she was injured after beatings, nothing has come out of this in form of further reporting. She has raised the question, but has not received the support she had hoped for from the health professionals. So little happened that could change the situation or hold her husband to account. She lost her hope, but has now taken refuge in a shelter after the last round of beatings. So you meet a woman in need of therapy, no doubt, but there's also a need for protection and confirmation from the state through police, health services, public case workers, etc. And they need to show that they're willing to protect and to support her. As psychologists, you're perfectly aware of the fact that the failure to protect and the lack of due diligence and other actions that may prevent, protect, or hold perpetrators to account are actually violations of human rights. That is, not doing anything is also a violation of human rights obligations. And the state has obligations under several of the conventions that they have most likely ratified, namely the CEDAW, the Convention on Elimination of All Kinds of Discrimination Against Women. We're also speaking about the Convention of Social, Cultural, and Economic Rights, as well as actually the Torture Convention itself. So in this case, with Sarah, you know that you have to consider also the right to rehabilitation and perhaps even compensation for her for what she has suffered. So with this in mind, you start working with a woman whose rights and mental health issues have been under threat for a very long time. So moving to Peter, a psychiatric patient. Peter has had a long story of psychiatric illness and has frequently been hospitalized over long periods of time. And he has also over the years been very distressed, often agitated, and even perceived as violent. But at times, he is both clear and direct, and he has been very concerned about his situation, including the fact that he has received a lot of medication, often also involuntarily. You meet Peter at the hospital. You are a new psychologist in this ward. When you meet Peter, he speaks about the forced medication that bothers him a lot. He also tells you that a number of times he has been held with mechanical restraints, and sometimes for long periods of time, also being afraid that the health workers have forgotten him in those restraints. His attempt at complaining about this has never resulted in anything else but a confirmation that in fact he has complained. What also bothers him is the lack of contact with the world outside, because he says being involuntarily taken to hospital was not the worst thing, but the worst is perhaps that I don't have any contact with the outside world. There's very few meaningful activities in the hospital, and the fact that he receives medication he does not want, and the use of restraints when he gets anxious and agitated, this is what really constitute problems for him. He says that they use the restraints a lot more often than they should. And he shows us marks, so he shows the psychologist marks on his wrist after the last time. Towards the end of the conversation with him, he tells you that he's gay and that he thinks that some of what is happening to him is discrimination, related both to his sexual identity and to the fact that his skin color makes him a minority on the ward. Also, this is problematic. So as a psychologist, you go to the first convention that you think seems relevant, namely the CRPD, the Convention on the Rights for Persons with Disabilities. But you find, of course, that the third that we just had on the screen here, on the rights for people under the Racial Discrimination Convention, is extremely important here too. But you first think now about the CRPD. And you go through some articles on self-determination, on supported decision, on the legal rights, etc. All of these important points in the CRPD. You also know that the Torture Committee, in fact, has said something about keeping people in restraints and forced medication as well, especially if this is used as a disciplinary measure, which is actually completely forbidden under international law. So based on these recommendations, both from the CRPD and from the CAT, the Committee Against Torture, you find all of these things you find for your own country on the UN homepage, but based on this information, you ask for a conversation with the head of the ward because you find that this situation is worrisome. Peter needs to be met in a different way from a psychological point of view, as well as from a human rights point of view. But you also want to speak to the national preventive mechanism, because as your country ratified the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture 5 years ago, and the NPM has recently been established, you are aware that these may come to visit the hospital at any time, and you will want to inform them about your concern, and perhaps they may come and see this case and look into the situation in this hospital. So the issues here that are in place are related to deprivation of liberty, non-consensual treatment, including forced medication and the use of restraints. All of these things are very serious. The information that you have now about the NPM, and you actually know a psychologist working in the NPM, seems also very useful. So you have a lot of things to work with in this case, both in relation to the CRPD, the Convention Against Torture, the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, as well as the Convention on Racial Discrimination. So in all of these three examples, and I've tried just to briefly present these on the screen, we see a number of human rights perspectives and principles raised. But at the same time, these rights are linked to obligations, human rights obligations that states are bound by as soon as they have ratified a convention. Because at this point, the conventions are legally binding to the countries, meaning that they can be reflected in the laws, they must be reflected in the laws, and also be directly applicable in the national courts. This means, of course, that all of us as psychologists in our services to the public are bound by these principles and laws. So this requires something of us. So what can we do? We have to be aware and have knowledge about human rights and the systems that monitor these, including complaint mechanism. We must contribute to reports on violations to national authorities or monitoring authorities. We can participate in reporting to international bodies in connection to periodic reports from the state to the UN and others. Because as you are aware, all states have are considered regularly, periodically, every 4 years to see how they comply with the obligation that they are bound by the conventions. So here, input from us as civil society, as professionals, is very useful for the bodies that in fact are assessing and considering the countries and the states. We can engage in national and monitoring mechanisms. We can engage in what the national institutions of human rights are doing. These are independent institutions in our countries. Most countries have under the different names, ombudspersons and others. We can participate, we can work there, we can have close contact with them because they are aware of the human rights situation and also often about the areas that we're working in. We have the national preventive mechanisms that I just mentioned and others. We can engage in the defense of human rights and human rights defenders. Today, we know that those working for human rights and to defend human rights are under severe threats. We are human rights defenders in our ways when we work this way, and we can also be threatened in many contexts in the world. This is something that needs our attention. We can engage in public debates and human rights and psychology, and we almost be sure to have a human rights perspective with you in your work. So to end my brief presentation, I want to refer to some very few examples from my own experiences, because I would like to say that both as a clinician, as a human rights activist, as a professor of psychology, and as a UN expert, I have fully and really felt the great value of psychology, its knowledge, its method, and its approaches in the vast field of human rights. Because human rights is about people's conditions and possibilities. And that is what we are too. This is so relevant. And there's a system out there to defend these rights. So being a psychologist, for instance, when I, as a member of CAT, discussed with authorities in different states on what they can do to prohibit torture, to prevent returning people to torture, or provide rehabilitation to victims of torture and the family, the background as a psychologist was extremely useful. And I knew also it added something. Then now, as a member of the SPT, the Subcommittee on the Prevention of Torture under the OPCAT, when visiting prison, closed migration centers, psychiatric unities, and other places where persons are deprived of their liberty, I sense so strongly that we as psychologists have so much to offer and so much to share, but also a lot to take back to our profession, to our science, and to our ethics. Experience and knowledge that will enrich the field of psychology as well as that as human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Nora, for your presentation. Now we move to Mike, and let's hope there were no snowstorms in Virginia, so the connection will be good. Mike, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Marlena. The video is on at my end, but it's not showing on the screen, but that's no problem. So I'm going to speak just a few ways in which international psychologists, many of whom are called to help out in humanitarian or emergency settings, can use child rights as a fundamental rudder for their work. So if I could have the next slide, please. So child rights are, of course, outlined in numerous instruments, principally the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and a group of supporting standards as well, such as the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child. And in a time of armed conflicts where we're seeing worldwide, from Yemen and Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, the list goes on and on. We find that children are having their rights assaulted en masse. And I'm going to suggest that child rights give us a way to guide a holistic approach, ethical practice, and attention to the dignity and rights of each child. This to me is terribly important because we know that armed conflict not only tears people up physically, but has profound impact on people's mental health and psychosocial well-being. And so I'm really quite interested in asking, how can we do this in an ethical, holistic manner? And this is where child rights comes in. The next slide, please. So I'm going to refer to multiple foundational principles within child rights, one of which is non-discrimination. This principle is really critical to make sure that amidst an emergency, the people who are already discriminated against or who have been made invisible for a whole variety of reasons receive the mental health and psychosocial care and the dignity and well-being that they deserve. In nearly every large-scale emergency, people who have disabilities do not receive the supports that they need. People who identify as LGBTQIA+, oftentimes are quite invisible. And there may be ethnicities, religions, castes, people who are from particularly poor backgrounds who are discriminated against. And the principle of non-discrimination urges us to correct this. So how does it work practically? Following the very large 2004 Asian tsunami, I was working in India with Child Fund, and I was in Tamil Nadu. And the Indian government was telling different NGOs where to work, which is not a bad thing because they ostensibly were doing it to coordinate. But we observed that in fact, they were asking people to set up in child-friendly spaces and to provide psychosocial support, non-formal education, and normalizing activities like socializing and play, only for groups that were medium or higher caste. They were explicitly directing us away from lower caste Dalit communities. When we noticed this, we quietly met with a group of Indian co-problem solvers, and we found a way to subsequently reach out and provide supports for the Dalit communities as well. So this was a concrete example of how we use child rights and the principle of non-discrimination to guide more ethical practice. And the key thing is that child rights are international standards. They're adopted by governments, but they supersede laws and policies that are implemented that violate those rights. And so this is terribly important at a time when we see the rise of lots of totalitarian and blatantly discriminatory government regimes. If I could have the next slide, please. Participation is one of the core rights of children, key for children and teenagers achieving their voice and agency, their dignity and well-being. But even though it's a fundamental right and it's child participation is something of a mantra amongst international NGOs, in fact, child participation is quite limited in many contexts. Lots of international NGOs use a top-down approach that places great expertise in the hands of outsiders who then analyze what the problems are, dictate what the interventions are. And children's voices and views are really marginalized and sidelined in this. It's really a continuation of an older colonial kind of approach. But participation is key not only for dignity, but I would argue for developing contextually appropriate, culturally grounded approaches. So one example was in Sierra Leone in West Africa, which had a decades-long brutal conflict. Teenage pregnancy was on the rise in around 2010 and thereafter. And that was linked with school dropout, early marriage, and a whole host of problems for girls. Teenage girls often became leaders in community discussions, using a community-led approach about what are the main harms to children. And the girls were quick to point out that a pregnancy meant that a girl had to drop out of school. Their families could not feed another mouth. And so oftentimes the girl mothers had to engage in sex work to support each other. Through their activities, they eventually made communities so watchful that it became impossible for older men to pull 15-year-old girls into the shadows and impregnate them. And it turned out that that kind of sexual abuse was responsible for about 40% of the teenage pregnancies. So this was work that was led by the girls themselves. In Angola, during its decades-long war, a lot of psychologists, as part of efforts to reintegrate former child soldiers, were attending appropriately to problems like post-traumatic stress disorder, which was a real problem. But in one case, a boy told us he was unable to sleep, and we asked why. And he said, well, the spirit of the man I killed comes to me and asks at night, why'd you do this to me? His belief and the belief of his family and community was that he was haunted by an unavenged spirit. And if he came back to the family and the community, that bad spirit would come with him and could jump literally into other people and harm them and even kill them. So his problem for reintegration was stigma based on this spiritual pollution. And so he asked, could we work with traditional healers who had a way of expunging the bad spirits, restoring spiritual harmony between the living and the ancestors, and enabling social acceptability. And my Angolan sister, Carlinda Montero, then organized for those rituals to be conducted as part of a more holistic approach to reintegration. And it made a huge difference in terms of community acceptance. So cultural kinds of resources and assets need to be attended to, and we need to enable local participation and hand significant power to local people to get these culturally grounded approaches. But I could have the next slide, please. Child rights also dictate a holistic approach. This is quite different from what one often sees in the humanitarian system. The system itself is divided into sectors: shelter, health, water and sanitation, protection, and so on. But child rights are indivisible, and that indivisibility favors a holistic approach, which is incredibly important. So to give an example, in setting up camps for internally displaced people, we've learned through hard experience that oftentimes rape and gender-based violence occur when women go to latrines placed in poorly lit areas where there's no lock on the door. So a very simple means of integrating some prevention for mental health and psychosocial support into this kind of situation is to provide locked latrines and very good lighting. And this is a way of reducing the gender-based violence that produces such horrendous psychological fallout. And similarly, people who've been displaced but who've lost loved ones, one of their main priorities is to bury their dead and to honor cultural practices and to engage in cultural bereavement. But to do that, the spaces that are organized for internally displaced people need to be designed in a way that provide space for the funeral rites and for the burial rites to be conducted. And when that's done, you get a more holistic approach and cultural approaches to holistic well-being that very definitely support people's mental health and psychosocial well-being. I could have the next slide, please. One of the strongest principles in child rights is the best interests of the child, meaning that the determining factor ought to be not logistics, politics, or even laws, but what is in the best interests of the well-being of the child. And as an example, in India, Afghanistan, many other countries, there's a widespread practice of placing children who are separated from their families or unaccompanied in orphanages or institutions, many of which are managed by the state or by private institutions. Nearly always, research has shown, those institutions cannot meet the child's needs for proper nutrition, for their own identity, for appropriate social behavior, as well as for mental health and psychosocial well-being. And we saw lots of do no harm issues come up with this approach following the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, where well-meaning church groups and even NGO groups set up orphanages for children, and many parents who were able to care for their children actually gave their children up, leaving them on the doorstep of the orphanages on the idea that maybe they would be better off, thereby depriving those children of the single most important determinant of a child's well-being, which is being in the care of a caring caregiver. So the best interest of the child principle has in many societies led to an emphasis on family care with monitoring, of course, and with attention to policy change. Could I have the next slide, please? Survival and development rights are another core principle, and I wanted to jump to a development setting, Bolivia. The first time I visited there, I found that in indigenous areas, the government was talking about how there was greater need for healthcare. It was very much a health technical focus. Children were malnourished. There were shortages of vaccinations. Children were dying of preventable problems. But it was very interesting that from a rights perspective, this was not just a health technical problem. This was a problem of discrimination. And when that was emphasized and reframed in that way, much greater progress was made in terms of changing government policies to ensure greater attention to the health of indigenous people and children. And if I could have the next slide, please. So in conclusion, I'm arguing that to be a good humanitarian worker, to be a good international psychologist requires attending very carefully to human rights. Each of us go out into difficult situations and we may observe something. I was working in Ukraine not too long ago, and I saw following an attack that children had died because children in an institution had been left unattended. It was my obligation to report that and follow up, which I did. This is just simply one example amongst thousands. So we're all monitors and reporters, defenders of human rights. We need to encourage survivors of rights violations to report, of course, recognizing the complexities. If people are going to endanger their own lives, then things need to be handled with great care and sensitivity. But we need to help develop strong reporting and referral processes. In our own practice, we need to constantly be self-critical and reflect, avoid unintended consequences, and prevent do no harm issues. And at the end of the day, we need to support mental health and psychosocial well-being in a holistic way that supports human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you both, Nora and Mike. When we were talking about, when we were preparing for today's presentation, we did ask from you to come up with some examples. It's really very relevant to have some ideas how actually human rights and psychology interact in practice. So thank you very much for the examples, either fictional or the real one, that show us this link, which is not only purely theoretical, but also very practical. Now, there are some questions that the audience made. There were some comments also while you were talking. There were some people supporting some ideas that you exposed. And we can maybe start, with some answers that, yeah, I'm sure Nora and Mike can provide. Let me see. Well, I wanted to ask the audience, as you can see, all of us, you cannot see Mary, who is behind the scene, but there is a similarity among us. So we can take only questions by people who wear glasses. That's the only condition. If you are wearing glasses, you are allowed to ask questions. Okay.
Marlena, we do have some that have been posted. Would it be okay if I present a few of these?
Sure.
Okay, so to either one of you, one question is that are there any stats or even a sense of how many psychologists are being trained or are available to provide support in the regions that you were discussing?
You want to start, Michael?
Mike, I think you're on mute still. There you go.
No, thank you for this question. I think the correct answer is we don't know. I mean, but in most countries, I'll use Ukraine as one example, there's a lot of work being done to, there's tremendous psychological expertise that exists in Ukraine, and but it's mostly been oriented towards individual and small group, not towards the large scale humanitarian work that's needed. There's a sophisticated psychiatric establishment, but it's oriented more towards, if I could be irreverent, beds, meds, and that kind of thing. And so, I mean, there is a movement to train people, and there's training being done by different universities. When you shift to sub-Saharan Africa, the situation is much worse. In countries having a population of 50 or 100 million people, it's not at all uncommon to still find only a handful, in some cases only 2 or 3 clinical psychologists or psychiatrists who are well trained. So this is a huge issue, and I urge you, partner your university with the universities in the Global South, engage in dialogue and co-learning, join hands together, and when the psychological training is done, build human rights into it, make that part of the foundation. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Nora?
Yeah, just fully support what Mike says here. And I think what we one of the things that we discussed, which was one of the reasons why the book was made and came out last year, was the fact that there's very little in the curricula for psychologists on human rights on a global level. This is of course changing, because having the two books that last year, both the one edited by Neil Rubin and the one by our group, is the first actually books that can be used in training. And then the next point comes, what can we do to ensure that this is included? And just to give the example from Norway, after some years with battling, we managed to have 3 sentences in the state directed program and conditions for what should a psychologist learn. And then we have to be informed about human rights and to know how this applies for psychological practice. So this is rather new with us, but this is something that we have to work on a global level. And as Mike says, I think nothing happens without those of us who are engaged really push for this, both on the academic level, but also on the more grassroots level for people working with people in the field who are exposed to violations and to human rights abuses. So on all levels, we need the activity and engagements.
So, I mean, Nora, you mentioned Neil. Neil has a question, and we have a sense of the answer, but like each of you to speak about it. Neil says that both of you use the word obligation in relation to acting in particular settings. Do you also see the teaching of HR is a responsibility for all psychologists?
Well, first of all, every single state that has ratified, for instance, the Convention Against Torture, has as its obligation to inform and to teach. It's Article 10. It's about informing and teaching law enforcement personnel, but also medical personnel. So yes, this is part of what the state should see as its obligation to do. And of course, that goes down again to the university and to teaching faculties. And if they don't see it, we have to remind them about it. So I think that's why we need to be aware of it. And it's not the only convention. There's a lot of them also on the regional level that emphasizes that making public servants aware of human rights is a part of the obligation. And with the obligations come the rights.
Got it.
Okay,
Mike, did you want to add anything?
No, I agree with that, and I'd like to respect the time and hear from questions from other people as well.
Okay.
Yeah. What
Marlene,
about this one?
Go ahead.
Could you expand on limits when is appropriate, if ever, to involuntarily subject someone to treatment? Do we have obligation to present choices, even in non-treatment situations? For example, observing someone behaving in open space. Very thought-provoking presentation, thank you. Perhaps, yeah, Nora, you tackled that question with the Peter case.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah, I was just looking at the question again, but no, I think that it's we have a lot to learn of how to deal with how also to face the situation where we have conflicting rights, because on one hand we have the right to have the highest attainable kind of treatment or healthcare possible. That's one of the rights. But on the other hand, there's also the right of other people to be safe. And if you are a source of danger, even if you are psychologically ill, there's also things going against that. And if you think that you don't need therapy, but everybody else thinks you need some care, how are we able to provide persons with the best form of therapy that they need? So again, we have all of those conflicting rights, and that's something we must be aware of, that it's not an easy, it's just not taking your right out of the book and finding this is simple. There will always be conflicting rights, and we have to deal with this. And it's a balance to deal with the individual, the family, the group, the collective, and strike a good balance. But yes, we have a lot of views of the conventions and of the rights.
Good, thanks, Nora.
Marlene, Nora, maybe, yeah, somebody asked for the books. Nora mentioned the books. Thank you, Neil Rubin and Roseanne Flores were the editors of the book, the Cambridge Handbook on Psychology and Human Rights, published by Cambridge University Press. The other book is Human Rights Education for Psychologists, published by Routledge. And you have information on both book on the website of the Global Network of Psychologists for Human Rights. Yeah.
I have another question I can present, I see posted. This is a question about schools around the world. How can we ensure that students are protected from subtle psychological threats, such as those from teachers who instill unnecessary fear in classes?
That's probably nothing one can ever guarantee, other than ensuring again that there are systems in place both for good teaching for the teachers, that there are complaints and places that the students can report. Because when students report about their feeling of being uneasy or feeling threats in any way, that this is also taken seriously. And I would say also having systems that can assist teachers to deal with their limitations if that's what they're struggling with.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I wanted to add to that, if I could, that one of the things that we need to address is the well-being of teachers, who these days, as Nora says, are under tremendous stress. And in humanitarian contexts, oftentimes teachers ask, how can I help my students who are struggling when I myself am struggling? I can't feed my family, and I've got 38 people living under our family's roof, and I don't know what to do. So I think paying more attention to teacher well-being and the well-being of all educational staff, taking a whole school kind of approach, is really very important in addressing these issues of fear. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. I do see another one here. What advice do you have for psychologists based in countries where the Human Rights Convention is not ratified?
And if I may add here something as well, Nora, you nicely linked the examples with the covenants or conventions that are there. So to what extent does a psychologist have to be familiar with the documents, with the covenants and so on, in order to be good at promoting human rights?
Just to try to make this into a brief reply, I mentioned only the UN conventions when I spoke, because of course there are regional. In Europe we have the European human rights, and you have the inter-American one. So, but I thought it was, since I know that we were speaking on a global level, it was good to unite with the UN. And in the UN system, there's a lot of different mechanisms and a lot of different declarations, etc. But we have what we call the 10 core treaties or conventions, which are the most famous ones, on the children that Mike spoke about, women, racial discrimination, or against torture, women's rights, all of those. And not all countries have ratified all. Most countries have ratified the CRC, or the Convention Against or on the Rights of Children, and the others are ratified by a high number of the states, the majority of the states, definitely, which means again that it is applicable in courts, and we as psychologists but not only know about them, but we must follow them and be aware of them. I think as psychologists, we're also part of civil society, and civil society has an extremely important role in pushing countries to ratify it if they haven't ratified, and if they ratify and don't follow, and then again, that's what we must participate in saying something about reporting. It's not illegal, it shouldn't be illegal, and it's not illoyal either. It's a way of assisting the state to comply with its obligation, which is good for any state.
Thanks, Nora.
I would argue, I like what Nora says, and I would argue that even if a state collapses and goes through very difficult political turmoil, and then reconstructs itself in a very totalitarian way, the human rights do not stop at their border. I mean, we've made human rights actionable as an international community. And it is not the right of someone like Hitler to draw boundaries and say, well, those rights don't apply here. I mean, the rights grew up specifically to deal with that kind of situation. And so I think that Nora's exactly right. Our job is to be part of the international civil society and use our eyes and ears and our wherewithal for activism and for networking to not just shame, but to work constructively with people to do things that are ultimately in the interest of the government's own people, and to draw a hard line when that hard line needs to be done. It's sort of the analog of whistleblowing on an individual level, but there are times when the international community has to draw a line and say, this will not stand. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Do you mean, Mike, that being a psychologist who is involved in protection of human rights always requires a bit of social activism?
Well, I'm biased on this because I'm a social activist, so I tend to think yes. But I mean, each individual needs to think carefully about how they're positioned, what they feel is most appropriate, what the realities of their situation are. And, you know, and I would hope that all of us would commit to being whistleblowers when the time comes. But I also think that you don't have to brand yourself as a social activist to be deeply caring about and supportive of human rights. You know, recognizing human dignity is as foundational a thing as is human empathy. And you don't need training on human rights to have empathy. All you need is a good dose of humanity. It's what every parent, what every friend experiences. And I would argue that human rights formalize and, you know, give, codify and give, you know, ethical breadth and space to these things. And so I think that nourishing dignity and rights can be done in countless numbers of ways. You don't have to be out there beating the drum and marching in the streets, even though I think there is a time for that too. You know, if there's a regime change and rights are being trampled en masse and nothing's being done about it, sitting by, to my mind, makes me complicit within that. So then it's time to challenge oneself. So thank you.
Yeah, I fully agree. And in addition, I'd like to say, I think what we're trying to do with this presentation is to also speak about human rights practically being inherent also in the objective of psychology. It's not something new that we need to learn about. Yes, we need to learn about the factual parts of the human rights, but the idea, the principles, the values, I consider them as part of what we do as psychologists. It's my obligation given as a psychologist to do these things. Then, of course, if we want to strengthen our work and our engagement on this, we can do that. But I think it's what we do as psychologists that counts. And these principles, as we see it, are part of our professional identity. People may disagree on that, but that's at least what Mike and I are quite agree on. Thank you.
You know, I would just like to jump in here and just say something. Unfortunately, we have to wrap this up simply because of time. We have many more questions, and this is a very interested group. Marlena, what would you like to say?
Exactly. I would just like to say how I saw it. So there are many questions and comments that we received. We will read them and see what of them what similarities they have, because we intend to have these webinars, this series of webinars, for at least 2 or 3 years. We already have some topics for this effort and for the next year, but we will see, because our global network of psychologists for human rights was born because there was a lack of tackling such topics. And it is not a coincidence that 2 books with the similar topics appeared at the same time. So apparently there was a need was huge, and you also assessed that there is lack of education, formal education for psychologists in the field of human rights. So we are going to shape our global network according to the needs. So your questions and comments will be included as well, and we will see what kind of things we can do further. So thank you for that. And
Thank you, Marlena. So maybe if we can just go to our final slide. So I want to very much thank all three of you, Marlene, Mike, Nora. This is an absolutely wonderful presentation. We had close to 300 people viewing us and posting comments. I want to draw everyone's attention to two things. Please note that you can have your certificate for attendance today will be sent to you if you provide your name and email, and by logging onto the Human Rights website and clicking on the webinar certificate link, we will send you your certificates for attendance there. Please also note that we have presentations coming up in March and May that are on the screen at the moment. And finally, thank you for everyone who joined today and took time out to be part of this presentation. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Marlena. Thanks, Nora. And thank you, Mary, who's behind the scenes, making sure this entire presentation runs smoothly. Enjoy your day or evening, and we look forward to seeing you at the next series of talks. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.